According to international maritime monitoring data and regional security reports, the Strait of Hormuz was suddenly shaken by a burst of live fire on one of the world's most critical shipping corridors, triggering immediate global concern. Within a very short time window, vessels flying British and French flags were reportedly struck while transiting the narrow passage, an area widely recognized as the primary artery for nearly one-third of global oil transportation. The incident unfolded rapidly, leaving almost no reaction time for nearby ships or monitoring systems, as emergency alerts began to spread across international maritime networks. Officials familiar with the situation indicated that the firepower was linked to forces associated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, commonly known as the IRGC, a key military entity tasked with protecting Tehran's strategic interests in the region. The sudden escalation has drawn immediate attention from Western governments, particularly as the affected vessels are connected to NATO member states, raising concerns about a broader security implication beyond the immediate zone of conflict. Military analysts note that any disruption in Hormuz carries disproportionate consequences, given the strait's role as a choke point through which a significant portion of the world's energy supply flows daily. At the same time, shipping companies began adjusting their routes, while several vessels reportedly slowed down or changed course as a precautionary measure, reflecting the growing uncertainty surrounding the safety of navigation in the area. In early assessments, no official casualty figures were immediately confirmed, but the strategic signal sent by the incident has already begun to ripple through both geopolitical and economic systems. The Iranian side has not issued a detailed public statement at this stage, yet the presence of IRGC-linked units in the operational area is being closely monitored by international observers. As the situation continues to develop, one critical question remains. Is this a localized maritime incident or the opening signal of a much larger confrontation centered around the world's most vital energy corridor? Welcome to our channel, where we provide in-depth analysis of major international developments shaping global security, geopolitics, and economic stability. The recent incident in the Strait of Hormuz is not occurring in isolation. Instead, it is unfolding within a highly sensitive geopolitical environment where tensions have been building over an extended period between Iran and Western powers, particularly those aligned with NATO. The Strait of Hormuz itself holds exceptional strategic importance. It is widely recognized as one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world, connecting the Persian Gulf to the global ocean system. On a daily basis, a substantial portion of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow corridor, making it a focal point of global energy security. Historically, the region has witnessed repeated episodes of tension, including confrontations involving naval forces, tanker seizures, and disputes over maritime control. These events have consistently demonstrated how fragile stability can be in this area, where even minor incidents have the potential to escalate rapidly. At the same time, Iran has long emphasized its geographical advantage in the region. With direct proximity to the strait, Tehran possesses the ability to influence, monitor, and potentially control movements within this vital passage. This strategic positioning has often been described by analysts as a form of leverage in broader geopolitical negotiations. Meanwhile, Western nations, particularly those dependent on energy imports, have consistently viewed the security of Hormuz as a matter of national and collective interest. Any disruption to the flow of oil through this corridor can immediately translate into global economic consequences, affecting not only energy markets but also transportation, manufacturing, and financial systems worldwide. In recent years, the broader Middle East has also been experiencing heightened volatility, with overlapping conflicts, shifting alliances, and increased military presence from multiple global actors. These overlapping dynamics create an environment where any single incident can trigger a chain reaction far beyond its initial scope. Against this backdrop, the reported attack on British and French vessels introduces a new layer of complexity. It is no longer solely about regional tension, but about the potential intersection between local confrontation and international security commitments. At the same time, the response from global markets has already begun to reflect the seriousness of the situation. Early indicators suggest fluctuations in oil prices, adjustments in shipping behavior, and increased caution among logistics operators. All of these developments point to a broader reality. Hormuz is not just a geographic location. It is a strategic pressure point capable of influencing the direction of global stability. As more details continue to emerge, several critical questions arise. Is this incident part of a calculated strategy by Iran to assert control over a key energy corridor? Could this event trigger a stronger military or diplomatic response from NATO-aligned nations? And more importantly, how vulnerable is the global economy to disruptions concentrated in such a narrow and highly contested space? According to maritime tracking systems and regional security observations, the situation escalated within a very short time frame as armed activity emerged directly on the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Initial reports indicate that vessels flying British and French flags were struck while transiting the corridor, with the incident unfolding rapidly and leaving minimal time for reaction. The engagement appeared to be precise and deliberate, suggesting prior preparation rather than a spontaneous confrontation. Witnessed movements on the water showed fast-approaching armed boats closing distance with targeted vessels before opening fire. The sequence of events approach, lock-in distance, and engagement was executed within a compressed time frame, highlighting a coordinated tactical pattern. Shortly after the incident, international maritime monitoring systems began registering multiple emergency signals across the area. Several ships reported irregular conditions while navigating the strait, prompting immediate caution measures across the shipping network. Shipping data indicated a visible change in vessel behavior. Tankers and cargo ships reduced speed, altered routes, or temporarily paused movement before entering the most sensitive zones of the corridor. A maritime operator quoted in early reporting stated, "The situation developed too quickly. By the time alerts were issued, several vessels had already taken evasive actions." This reaction was not isolated. Multiple logistics operators activated contingency protocols, recalculating routes and adjusting timelines under rapidly changing conditions. As the situation intensified, the presence of forces linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps became more visible in the operational area. Patrol activity increased, with units maintaining proximity to key maritime pathways. Analysts note that this type of deployment allows for direct monitoring and immediate response capability within the narrow geographic constraints of the strait. Within hours, the impact extended beyond immediate physical damage. Maritime traffic density began to decline noticeably, reflecting a shift in risk perception among global shipping operators. Insurance indicators also responded quickly, with risk assessments for vessels transiting the region reportedly increasing in a short period of time. This shift suggested that the incident had already begun influencing the cost structure of global maritime operations. At the same time, the broader implications of the incident became more apparent, with vessels linked to NATO member states affected. The event introduced a layer of strategic sensitivity that extended beyond commercial shipping. Each vessel operating in the region is not only a transport unit but also a representation of national and alliance interests. Any direct impact on such assets carries potential implications for collective security considerations. Meanwhile, Iran's operational posture appeared consistent with a strategy focused on asserting control over the immediate environment. The concentration of activity within the strait, combined with the timing and execution of the engagement, signaled a deliberate attempt to influence the flow of maritime movement through the corridor. A regional security analyst summarized the situation by stating, "Control in Hormuz is not declared through statements, it is demonstrated through presence and action." As the hours progressed, the chain reaction continued to expand. Shipping routes were adjusted, risk thresholds recalibrated, and monitoring systems remained on high alert as authorities attempted to assess the full scope of the incident. The Strait of Hormuz, already recognized as a strategic chokepoint, had effectively entered a phase of heightened operational tension. To fully understand the significance of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, it is necessary to look beyond the immediate incident and examine the deeper historical and geopolitical context surrounding this narrow but highly strategic waterway. The Strait of Hormuz has long been recognized as one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. At its narrowest, the passage is only about 20 to 21 miles wide. Yet it carries a substantial share of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas exports on a daily basis. This geographic constraint makes the entire global energy supply chain highly dependent on a single, vulnerable corridor, where even minor disruptions can produce immediate and far-reaching consequences. Historically, control over Hormuz has been contested for centuries. From early imperial rivalries in the 16th century to modern geopolitical competition, the strait has consistently served as a focal point for power projection and trade dominance. In the modern era, tensions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz have been closely tied to the broader relationship between Iran and Western powers, particularly the United States. Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which transformed Iran into an Islamic republic and severed its alignment with Western-backed leadership, the strategic dynamic of the region shifted significantly. Since that point, the relationship between Tehran and Washington has been characterized by recurring cycles of confrontation, sanctions, and military signaling. Over the decades, Iran has repeatedly signaled its capability and willingness to influence traffic through the strait, often in response to economic pressure or military presence from Western forces. Statements from Iranian military leadership have, at various points, suggested that if Iran's own oil exports were restricted, then other countries' energy shipments could also face disruption within the same corridor. At the same time, the United States and its allies have maintained a consistent naval presence in the region, aiming to ensure freedom of navigation and prevent any unilateral control over this critical passage. This dynamic has created a persistent state of strategic tension, one in which Hormuz functions not just as a transit route, but as a geopolitical pressure point. Past incidents have reinforced this reality. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the so-called tanker war phase saw direct attacks on oil vessels, raising fears of a complete shutdown of maritime traffic. More recently, multiple cases of tanker seizures, naval confrontations, and military exercises have demonstrated how quickly tensions in the region can escalate. In some instances, even routine navigation has turned into a flashpoint as ships were intercepted, redirected, or warned off under contested interpretations of maritime authority. At the same time, Iran has developed asymmetric naval capabilities tailored specifically for operations in confined waters like the Strait of Hormuz. These include the use of fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and coordinated swarm tactics, all designed to maximize impact within a narrow geographic space. Such capabilities allow Iran to exert influence without requiring large-scale conventional naval dominance, instead leveraging speed, proximity, and tactical flexibility. Meanwhile, the global reliance on Hormuz has only increased over time. A significant portion of energy exports from major producers such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar must pass through this corridor, with limited alternative routes available. This structural dependency means that any instability in the strait is immediately transmitted into global markets, affecting oil prices, shipping costs, and economic confidence. Recent developments in 2026 have further demonstrated how quickly this vulnerability can translate into real-world disruption. Shipping traffic has dropped sharply during periods of heightened tension, with some reports indicating that only a handful of vessels were able to pass through the strait within a 2-4-hour window, a dramatic decline from normal levels. Such fluctuations highlight the fragility of the system. They also reinforce a broader strategic reality. Control over Hormuz does not necessarily require a full closure. Even limited disruption, uncertainty, or perceived risk is enough to alter global trade behavior. Against this backdrop, the recent incident involving vessels linked to Western nations takes on a deeper meaning. It is not simply an isolated event, but part of a long-standing pattern in which Hormuz is used as both a physical and strategic lever. As tensions between Iran and Western powers continue to evolve, the strait remains at the center of a complex equation, one that combines geography, military capability, economic dependency, and political signaling. This raises a critical question moving forward. Is the current situation a continuation of historical patterns, or does it mark a shift toward a more direct and sustained confrontation in one of the world's most sensitive strategic corridors? To understand why the Strait of Hormuz can be destabilized so quickly, it is essential to examine not only geography, but also the specific military method Iran has built for this environment. The core of that method is not conventional naval dominance in the traditional sense. It is denial, disruption, and pressure concentrated inside a narrow maritime corridor. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, or IRGC Navy, has long been structured to operate primarily inside the Persian Gulf and especially around the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran's regular navy is more associated with wider external waters. This division matters because Hormuz is exactly the kind of battle space for which the IRGC Navy has prepared over many years. The strait is narrow, heavily trafficked, and geographically restrictive. That combination reduces reaction time for commercial shipping and increases the effectiveness of short-range, mobile, and layered threats. U.S. Energy assessments have repeatedly described Hormuz as the world's most important oil transit choke point. With disruption, they're capable of creating immediate supply delays, higher shipping costs, and upward pressure on energy prices. Within that space, the IRGC's tactical logic is relatively clear. Rather than relying on a small number of large surface combatants, it emphasizes a dispersed network of pressure tools. Fast attack craft, fast inshore attack craft, shore-based anti-ship missiles, naval mines, drones, and small units operating close to the coastline and islands. Maritime analysts and military studies consistently describe this as an asymmetric sea denial approach built for the Gulf littorals. Fast boats are a central element of this model. Their value is not only speed, but timing, mass, and unpredictability. In a constrained waterway, multiple small craft can approach from different angles, compress decision time, and force a target to divide attention between navigation, threat detection, and evasive action. U.S. and specialist naval analysis has long noted Iran's preference for swarm-style pressure, using numerous smaller platforms rather than classic one-on-one naval engagement. This is where geography multiplies military effect. Hormuz does not need to be fully sealed to become strategically dangerous. If ship captains, insurers, and operators believe the route has become too risky, traffic slows, reroutes, or pauses. That alone can create commercial paralysis. Recent U.S. energy reporting and market analysis show that even the threat of attacks in and around Hormuz can send tanker rates higher, disrupt normal shipping behavior, and tighten oil availability to world markets. Anti-ship missiles add another layer to this pressure system. Military analyses of Iran's doctrine describe a layered model in which coastal launchers, island positions, and maritime platforms can all contribute to a denial zone. In practical terms, that means a ship transiting Hormuz is not facing a single direction of risk. It may be entering a contested envelope, in which threats can emerge from shore, sea, or low-altitude systems. Naval mines are equally important, even when they are not visibly present. Their psychological effect can be as powerful as their physical effect. The mere suspicion that waters may have been mined forces slower transit, more inspection, and often the deployment of countermeasure assets. Historical U.S. naval accounts and policy analysis have shown that mines in the Gulf can trigger disproportionate operational disruption relative to their cost. Drones deepen the problem further. In a narrow maritime battle space, one-way attack drones or surveillance drones can expand targeting awareness, complicate defensive calculations, and add another layer of uncertainty over ship movement. Recent naval analysis of the Strait of Hormuz has highlighted that vessels transiting the passage may be exposed simultaneously to missiles, mines, fast boats, and drone threats. What makes this structure effective is not any single platform by itself. It is the combination. A fast craft swarm can force confusion. A missile threat can keep ships at distance. Mines can slow or channel movement. Drones can extend surveillance or strike options. Together, these tools create a maritime environment in which control is exercised through cumulative pressure rather than permanent occupation. That is the technical meaning of control in Hormuz. It is not necessarily about raising a flag over the waterway. It is about shaping behavior inside it. If ships hesitate, if insurers reprice risk, if operators delay transit, and if oil flows begin to tighten, then strategic influence has already been achieved. This is why many experts argue that Iran does not need to close the strait for a long period to generate a global effect. Even short-term disruption can impose heavy economic costs while preserving ambiguity about the scale of escalation. Several analyses note that Iran may not be able to shut the Gulf indefinitely, but it can severely restrict or threaten shipping for shorter periods through concentrated asymmetric action. In this context, The reported use of direct fire against vessels linked to Western states carries broader significance. It suggests a method consistent with how the IRGC has long been understood to operate in confined Gulf waters. Test the corridor, compress reaction time, raise risk, and force the rest of the system to respond on Iran's timing. That is why Hormuz remains one of the most dangerous strategic spaces in the world. Not because it is wide enough for conventional fleet warfare, but because it is narrow enough for asymmetric pressure to shake global markets in real time. As the security situation in the Strait of Hormuz intensified, the diplomatic response began expanding just as quickly. What initially appeared to be a maritime confrontation rapidly evolved into a broader international issue, drawing in European governments, regional security partners, and multilateral institutions concerned with navigation rights and energy stability. Recent official statements from the United Kingdom and European diplomatic reporting show that attacks on shipping in and around Hormuz are now being treated not only as security incidents, but as matters with direct global economic consequences. The United Kingdom has been among the clearest voices in framing the issue. In its statement at the United Nations in mid-April, the UK said that attacks on international shipping in the Gulf had been deeply damaging for the world, emphasizing that navigational rights and freedoms are a cornerstone of the global economy. London also stated that Iran does not have the right to unlawfully impede transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz. That language is significant because it places the confrontation not only in military terms, but in legal and diplomatic terms as well. At the same time, British diplomacy has moved beyond statements alone. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the UK had brought together 35 nations around a statement of intent on maritime security across the Gulf, while the Foreign Secretary was set to host a meeting to assess diplomatic and political measures. This suggests that London is attempting to build a wider international framework rather than react through a narrow bilateral lens. France has also moved into a more visible diplomatic role. On April 17, French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer co-chaired a conference focused on maritime navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, underscoring that Paris and London are trying to shape a coordinated European response around freedom of navigation and regional stability. Within the European Union, the tone has also hardened. Reuters reported on April 20 that the EU was preparing to broaden its Iran sanctions regime to target individuals and entities responsible for obstructing navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. This is a crucial development because it means the response is not limited to condemnation. It points toward the use of legal and financial tools designed to raise the cost of maritime interference. At the alliance level, however, the picture is more complex. Reuters reported earlier in April that several NATO allies refused to join a U.S. plan to blockade Iranian ports, preferring instead to support maritime security measures after active fighting ends. That distinction matters. It suggests that while concern is widespread, there is still no full consensus inside the Western camp on how far military involvement should go. This diplomatic hesitation reflects a deeper strategic dilemma. On one side, Western governments want to defend freedom of navigation and reassure energy markets. On the other, they are aware that a direct military escalation in Hormuz could widen the conflict, expose commercial shipping to even greater danger, and place alliance unity under pressure. That is why many of the current responses are being framed through diplomacy, sanctions, coordination, maritime security conferences, and legal language rather than immediate large-scale joint combat commitments. Meanwhile, the United Nations and maritime safety actors are increasingly focused on the human dimension of the crisis. Reuters reported that roughly 20,000 seafarers and hundreds of ships have been left stranded by the disruption around Hormuz, while international concern has grown over crew safety as traffic through the strait remains severely restricted. This detail is important because it shifts the issue from high strategy alone to a direct humanitarian and commercial problem. The commercial sector has reacted in parallel. The UK Chamber of Shipping said it remained deeply concerned by the disruption to commercial shipping in and around Hormuz, warning of serious risks to seafarers and to the stability of global trade. In practical terms, that means the diplomatic crisis is being reinforced by pressure from the shipping industry itself. At the same time, a more chaotic layer has emerged around the crisis. Reuters reported warnings from maritime risk specialists about scam messages offering ships supposed safe transit through Hormuz in exchange for cryptocurrency. That reveals how quickly disorder in strategic waterways can generate secondary threats beyond missiles and gunfire, including fraud, misinformation, and exploitation of stranded crews and ship operators. Taken together, these reactions show that the Hormuz crisis is no longer confined to a narrow strip of water. It is now operating simultaneously on several levels: military tension, alliance politics, sanctions policy, maritime law, commercial risk, and humanitarian concern, and that is what makes the diplomatic fallout so significant. The ships may have been hit at sea, but the consequences are now unfolding in European capitals, international institutions, shipping boardrooms, and energy markets around the world. The key question now is no longer whether the incident matters internationally. That is already clear. The real question is whether diplomacy can move fast enough to stabilize the corridor before security incidents at sea begin forcing governments into harder choices. As the situation in the Strait of Hormuz continues to evolve, analysts are now focusing on what could happen next. The current trajectory does not point to a single predictable outcome. Instead, it opens the door to multiple scenarios, each carrying different levels of risk for regional stability and the global economy. The first scenario is escalation. In this case, further incidents at sea could trigger a more direct military response from NATO-aligned countries, particularly if additional vessels linked to Western nations are targeted. Such a development would mark a shift from controlled tension to open confrontation. Naval deployments could increase, escort missions could be expanded, and rules of engagement could be adjusted to allow for more proactive defensive measures. However, this path carries significant risks. Any miscalculation in a confined maritime space like Hormuz could rapidly spiral into a wider conflict, drawing in multiple actors and potentially extending beyond the Gulf region. The second scenario is controlled tension. Under this outcome, incidents may continue at a limited scale, with both sides avoiding actions that would trigger full-scale escalation. Iran could maintain pressure through intermittent disruptions, while Western nations respond through diplomatic channels, sanctions, and increased monitoring rather than direct confrontation. This scenario reflects a pattern that has been observed in the region before: a balance between signaling strength and avoiding uncontrollable escalation. While less dramatic than open conflict, it still carries long-term consequences. Shipping costs remain elevated, insurance premiums stay high, and global energy markets continue to operate under a cloud of uncertainty. The third scenario is de-escalation. In this case, diplomatic efforts succeed in stabilizing the situation, possibly through indirect negotiations or coordinated international pressure. Shipping routes gradually return to normal, and risk perception begins to decline. However, even under this scenario, the underlying tensions would not disappear. The structural vulnerabilities of the Strait of Hormuz, its narrow geography, strategic importance, and political sensitivity would remain unchanged. This means that stability, if achieved, could still be temporary. Beyond these three core scenarios, there is a broader layer of risk that extends into the global system. Energy markets are particularly sensitive. Even minor disruptions in Hormuz can create price volatility, influence supply expectations, and impact inflation in energy-dependent economies. At the same time, global supply chains could face secondary effects. Delays in shipping, rerouting of vessels, and increased operational costs may gradually affect industries far removed from the Gulf region. There is also a strategic dimension to consider. If the perception takes hold that the Strait of Hormuz is no longer fully secure, countries may begin accelerating efforts to diversify energy routes, invest in alternative supply chains, or increase strategic reserves. Such shifts could reshape long-term geopolitical and economic alignments. In addition, alliance dynamics may come under pressure. Differences in how countries assess risk, respond to incidents, and prioritize economic versus security concerns could create friction within existing partnerships. As all these factors unfold, one element becomes increasingly clear: the situation is not static. It is a dynamic process, where each decision, each signal, and each reaction feeds into the next phase of development. And in a space as constrained and strategically critical as Hormuz, the margin for error remains extremely small. This leads to a final and critical question. Will the coming days push the region toward escalation, sustain a fragile balance, or open a path toward stabilization before a single misstep changes the trajectory entirely? As the situation in the Strait of Hormuz continues to unfold, the key elements of this crisis are becoming increasingly clear. What began as a sudden burst of firepower targeting vessels in one of the world's most critical maritime corridors has quickly evolved into a multi-layered issue involving military tension, global energy security, diplomatic pressure, and economic uncertainty. The incident has highlighted once again how fragile the balance is in a region where geography, strategy, and political interests intersect. A narrow stretch of water only a few miles wide now holds the power to influence global oil flows, reshape shipping behavior, and trigger responses from major international actors. At the center of this evolving situation is a simple but powerful reality. Control in Hormuz is not only about territory. It is about influence. It is about the ability to shape decisions, alter risk perception, and affect the movement of goods that the global economy depends on. The events described in this report demonstrate how quickly local actions can produce global consequences. Within hours, shipping routes were disrupted, market signals shifted, and diplomatic channels were activated across multiple regions. And yet, despite the scale of the reaction, the situation remains unresolved. No definitive outcome has emerged. No stable equilibrium has been restored. Instead, the Strait of Hormuz now stands as a live and active pressure point in the international system. This raises a broader question about the future of global stability. How resilient is the current system when such a critical choke point can be affected so rapidly? And how prepared are governments, industries, and alliances to respond if similar disruptions occur again or escalate further? For viewers and observers around the world, this is not just a distant geopolitical issue. It is a development that can influence fuel prices, supply chains, and economic conditions far beyond the Middle East. As events continue to develop, staying informed will be essential. Understanding not only what is happening, but why it is happening and what could come next is key to navigating an increasingly complex global environment. If you found this analysis useful, make sure to follow the channel for continued coverage of major international developments. Leave your thoughts in the comments. How do you assess the risks surrounding the Strait of Hormuz? And do you believe the current situation is heading toward escalation or stabilization?